We're running this protest. Keep going.
Lying media, lock it up!
They're telling the lies for the fucking government. They have fucking blood on their hands. Because if they create a fucking civil war, we'd be knocking on your doors as well.
We're standing out with a kid. We're standing up for the kids. We're doing a corner.
They're all fucking lovely. Most of them even Ukrainian.
Is everybody on those marches subscribed to the far right 100%? No, I wouldn't say so. I would say there's lots of people there who are just very concerned about the fact that they can't find housing or their children can't find housing, or other issues as well, such as health and education. When I see the far right as political entities which are attempting to spread a particular way of looking at our social problems, which is essentially nativist, it's essentially racist, it's essentially white supremacist, and that's the frame that they want to establish, with a projection to have political representation eventually.
But with regards to these men, we don't know who they are. The elements that we don't know is what has us afraid. And I have children and grandchildren in this community, and I'm here to protect my children and my grandchildren. And I hope that the future is good for them. Thank you very much.
I think it's important not to brand people as the far right, to recognise that when we're talking about the far right, we're talking about particular political organisations, and keep it open, the fact that we have got to convince people that there are other ways to solve social problems.
The far right in Ireland is a curious beast. Essentially, there are a number of very small groups who, up till relatively recently, had a decidedly old-fashioned sort of version of Irish politics. If you look at some of the videos put up by some of the figures in, some of the ones that would call themselves political parties, you'd see that have the Irish tricolour in one corner, the proclamation. So it's almost as if basically they're trying to reenact themselves as Patrick Pearse. In a sense, they're talking about a version or vision of Ireland that most Irish people wouldn't really identify with. It's a sort of an isolationist nationalism that hasn't really done well in recent decades in Ireland.
That programme aims at building up our industries so that the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the houses we live in, may all, as far as is reasonably possible, be produced by Irish labour from Irish materials.
And if you think about it, like, Ireland was sort of a far right state back before the 1980s, in the sense that, it was nativist, which is one of the characteristics that Cass Moodis says of the far right. And it also was deeply religious, looking at religion from the perspective of the nuclear heterosexual family. And we had all sorts of laws against divorce, against abortion, against contraception and so on. These are all things that many far right parties argue.
In essence, some of these far right groups up till relatively recently were calling out for an Ireland that could no longer exist unless you had a time machine to travel back in time. What we're seeing now is something a bit more febrile because of the internet, because of social media, where basically you're getting a lot of activism online.
The fake news Irish Times, who are traitors to the Irish people, folks. The people like yourselves will be brought to justice for this, destroying Ireland.
And some of this is now carrying over into physical protests, but it is still in a very, very small grouping, and it would be very hard to think of the far-right political parties, or the groups that call them as such, as players in Irish politics.
And over the weekend, there's talk about the protest here being infiltrated by far-right elements.
They're not the viewpoints of the locals here. Yes, of course, there has been people trying to jump on the bandwagon. That is their goal or their aim. Stay well away from this. This is a people's right and a people's process in a peaceful manner to bring about a resolution.
Well, the current protests stretch back really to 2018, 2019, when there were these small but quite noisy protests outside proposed direct provision centres all across the country, and including some arson attacks.
Start of March 2018, there was a lot of social media posts about how bad immigrants were, and they were associating with everything, violence, rape. The community meetings were handy insofar as they got people together and they got to air their views. So I just offered to facilitate then and gave everyone an opportunity to say what they wanted, but I asked them to frame it in a question. So if they started ranting and raving, I'd say, well, how does that equate into a question? And we were there for a few hours getting the questions. You know, the questions demonstrated input from the far right. What religion are these people going to be? Are they vetted? I stood up in the community, there was a group stood up, we facilitated the response and kind of figured out where to go with it.
It's been 5 years since that direct provision centre was opened. Was there an increase in crime since then?
No. If anything, and it's mainly women and children in the direct provision centre. And September, that's a time of matchmaking in this Dunvarna. And we had to explain to the women, like, September there's going to be an influx of men that will be looking for women. And nearly warned them to watch themselves for September. So it was quite the opposite. One of the main things that I had to say at the time was we were more afraid of these far-right people coming to our community. We were more afraid of what they were going to do to us than we were of anyone coming into the direct provision centre. And we had every right to be. The way they followed who we were, they screenshot our Facebook posts and our profiles, and they targeted anyone who was in any way welcoming to the direct provision. So we were more afraid of them than we were of asylum seekers.
The targeted vitriol and dehumanisation of unvaccinated people is exactly the same technique that was used against Jewish people in 1930s Germany.
And then in the intervening years, the pandemic, allowed the same people to organise these mass protests against vaccines and against the lockdowns, and also to make a lot of money. And it's those same people now that are organising the current protests.
Are we going to be batting charge today? Innocent protesters.
Nobody in Ireland is earning the kind of money that big figures in the US would make, but there is good reason to believe that a small pool of people are making a substantial amount of money.
And you're working for the New World Order, you unintellectual fools! You donkeys!
Fear and anger are really primal emotions, so we all will respond quite viscerally to fear and anger. And then on social media itself, it's all about engagement, and content that is very emotional will generate more engagement. So those two incentives overlap.
These migrants, or whatever you want to call them, coming into our country, it needs to stop.
But then if you think about the current protests as well, scapegoating migrants, drumming up fears about foreign men, exploiting local fears, all of those things are part of an age-old pattern of sowing division. And it's age-old because it's very effective, and it relies and runs on fear.
We're out for the safety of our kids. That's all we're here for. And they're not safe in the streets of Dublin anymore, are they? No! Are we going to put up with it? No! What are we going to do?
And when it comes down to it, there's this very patriarchal worldview that says men must stand up and protect women from these invading foreigners. And that narrative is there throughout history, and you'll find it across the world.
Muchos compatriotas, muchos vecinos nos han dicho que no han llevado a sus hijos al colegio por el miedo que tienen por las personas que están deambulando. Nos encontramos ante una auténtica invasión del territorio nacional, una invasión dirigida y planificada por un país vecino, una invasión que ha lanzado a miles de personas, la mayor parte de ellos varones en edad militar, a nuestro suelo, también a muchísimos jóvenes, muchísimos menores que son...
When Vox, the far-right party in Spain, were emerging, I went to some meetings, and one of the things that people always said to me is like that Vox was saying what everybody was thinking. So there's this idea about the majority, that this is something that the majority thinks.
¿Sabe lo que pasa? Que estoy harto. Hoy salgo aquí, me pongo la bandera de mi país y salgo a la calle a decir lo que pienso. Porque somos mayoría.
And there are real concerns there. There are real concerns around housing. There are real concerns around access to health, access to education, and so on and so forth. But the far right is playing on those particular concerns and trying to adopt them as their own in order that they can use their narrative and their discourse around that, which is about sowing division.
The US
has become a dumping ground for everybody else's problems. When Mexico sends its people, they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
Again, it's going back to this idea of a playbook. It's been tried and tested in other countries, it's worked, and that's exactly the tactic that's being used here as well.
Immigration is an issue, and it is perfectly legitimate for people to have different views on migration, on immigration, on what a country's policies should be. It is perfectly legitimate to have discussions on these things. However, the idea that Ireland is full doesn't, well, it depends what you mean by that. I grew up in County Clare, which when I was growing up had a population of 90,000. In the 1830s it had a population of more than 250,000. So was Ireland full then? Was Ireland full in the 1830s? You know, when we look at the Ukrainians and other immigrants coming in, they amount to a tiny proportion of people living in Ireland. The problems we face are perhaps some of the problems we've had anyway. I don't think blaming any of this on immigrants makes much sense. Asylum seekers is something different because of the way it is set up. In 1951, there was the UN Convention on the Rights of Refugees. We signed that in 1956. Like most European countries, our policy is distinctly cynical. To give an example, there are millions of refugees in the world, roughly 20 million refugees registered with the UNHCR. Most of those are living in sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East or elsewhere in the global south. Very few of them are allowed into Europe. Between, say, 2015 and recently, we've only allowed in less than 2,000 Syrian refugees through the UN resettlement programme, when Turkey allowed in 3 million. So typically what we've done in the West is say we value the UN Convention of treating refugees well in terms of our obligations on the Convention, and then what we can to keep as many as possible out, whilst not offering legal routes of migration to people from a whole range of countries. So we see people coming from countries such as Georgia at the moment, and many other countries, people who we might not regard as legitimate asylum seekers compared to, say, people fleeing a war that's immediately happening. But nevertheless, such people have no other route to make a legal journey. And essentially that's what asylum seekers are trying to do. They're trying to make a legal journey to do what Irish people did in their millions, to make a better life for themselves. There's perhaps no easy answer when it comes to changing asylum policy, but we do have obligations to people. The challenge is to basically enable people to move on to having productive lives as soon as possible.
Okay, let's take housing for example. You can say on the one side that the reason that we don't have any housing is because there isn't enough to go around, and if we stop foreigners coming in, therefore more Irish people will have access to housing. But there's another narrative that you can say is that one of the reasons why we don't have enough housing is because of government policy and successive government policies, and not because of the fact that foreigners are coming here. And what's important is to try to redirect that narrative, to try to bring different frames to people about thinking about these issues and how these issues can be solved.
The migrants and the refugees are not the problem with us. Our government is the problem. Our government can't fix this country. They can't fix anything.
Do you feel like you have any political hold?
No. We've no political hold. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, they've been in power over 100 years between them, and now they're in together. 100 years of two parties. Now look where we are now, with two parties. We need an alternative. I was voting Sinn Féin all my life. But Sinn Féin just have abandoned the working class as well. They're not helping the work. They're not engaging with us either.
Ma première mesure comme présidente de la République sera de remettre des frontières à la France. L'immigration massive n'est pas une chance pour la France. C'est un drame pour la France.
You go to France and you look where the Rassemblement National is, the old National Front, you'll find that their strongest bastions are in areas where the Communist Party used to be most voted for. But from the 1980s onwards, the Communist Party began to leave those communities, partially because the factories where people worked were closing down. And as a result, there was a vacuum left there which the far right filled, and the far right now has replaced the Communist Party in those old industrial areas in France. So it's the creation of a vacuum due to the fact that politics is not working, and that leaves up a space for the far right to move in and to be able and to try to occupy that space. Now, there's one difference I think with Ireland, that it's Sinn Féin who's occupying that space. It has organised itself in local communities, for example. It's become the most popular party in the state. In a way, we've turned more to the left than the right.
We believe the election of the generation. We are here to serve, to work hard for everybody.
But if Sinn Féin does get into power eventually, if it does form a government and then does not deliver, that will disenchant people of Sinn Féin and they'll have nowhere else to go. And that then could possibly open up a vacuum where the far right will move in. And in many ways, you know, the far right is battling for the same territory that Sinn Féin is organised in.
My sense of it at the moment is that all Irish political parties in the mainstream, and I include Sinn Féin in this, they're not chasing all the voters, they're chasing roughly 70% of the voters. There are perhaps up to 30% of voters in Ireland that, as far as I can make out, no political party is seriously trying to attract. Especially since the marriage equality referendum and the abortion referendum, there's a significant constituency of people around the country who are not being spoken to. And my worry at times is that sometimes in the mainstream, that these are essentially being treated with some degree of disrespect. Now, this does not make any of these people far right. They may be conservative on some issues, less conservative on other issues. In other words, they may be mass-going or opposed to abortion, but they might be working with refugee integration in their town, village or community. So these are people like anybody else who have complex views on life. But the idea that somebody on the far right, as we now understand it, can galvanise such people and then galvanise a large number of other people with very disparate views around the country and turn those into a kind of an entity, something like, say, the Republican Party in the United States, that is capable of making some serious inroads into our politics, is highly unlikely.
The only one who stands up what everybody is thinking you said. Now, and the best of luck to you.
The Peter Casey case is a very interesting one. Casey's stood in the presidential election and did significantly well, but what's really interesting is that with each successive election that he stood, rather than building support, his support base shrunk. I would imagine it shrunk as the novelty of his candidacy wore off. The place of breakthrough, if it happens, is if mainstream politicians somehow buckle and admit some of the worse ideas that are coming perhaps from anti-immigrant voices into the mainstream of their thinking. In other words, basically offering up things that perhaps most people wouldn't support. I don't think most people in Ireland are really for treating asylum seekers and other vulnerable migrants more harshly. I think, if anything, they want to know how to make to work better.
We are standing up, 3 of us today. Vents or Amos, we will overcome. Good old soapbox stuff. Why not? Fuck it.
Racist scum, go home! Bye! Get that agitator!
So there's one issue around maybe the rise of far-right and extremist groups. A separate issue would be the spread of disinformation and these false narratives. Another issue again might be declining trust in media, and we need to be addressing all of these things at the same time. In terms of disinformation, specifically, the Future of Media Commission recommended the development of a national counter-disinformation strategy that could be looking at things like how do we embed media literacy in the school curriculum, how do we support valuable journalism and so on.
There's no point standing here outside the guard station. You have to go to where the freaking stand and burn the fucking end.
But false claims in themselves, people may or may not believe them. When people are then inciting violence, that is a separate issue, and those are crimes and they need to be dealt with differently.
Nobody told us what to expect. When the community facilitated the response and kind of figured out where to go with it, why didn't the government do that? We were just left to whatever information was thrown at us. Everyone else was informing the people of Lisdoonvarna except the government. But that seems to be missing still. I mean, that's leaving a massive void. And as people become more disenfranchised and are not happy with the services, I wouldn't be surprised if they grew their numbers. I don't know how effective that will be politically, but I'd be afraid that it would be dangerous and violent.
If government wants to fight the right and the far right into the future and fight anti-immigrant feeling and sentiment, it needs to take ownership of the issue and demonstrate that it is on top of it, that we can handle it. We have one refugee reception centre at City West. We probably need 4 of these at the very minimum. We need purpose-built accommodation to be able to accommodate people. We need plans and strategies to be able to settle people into communities.
What can we do? There is a war in Ukraine. Therefore, we come to Ireland. But if possible, when the war is finished, and we will go back to Ukraine, inshallah.
What's this about, lads? Everything. Get in it, bro. Get in it. Yeah, we've got 2 minutes.
So perhaps we need to keep our nerve and be steady, but complacency, we don't have any room for complacency. We need to be very, very proactive in building the capacity of the Republic of Ireland to work as a diverse republic. That requires basically engaging with people with different views. That requires building infrastructure in communities. That involves prioritising social cohesion measures. That involves long-term planning in the anticipation that maybe the Ukrainian war isn't going to be the last crisis we face in what will be perhaps a very kind of difficult 21st century for many people around the world.
Refugees welcome!